everyone, I'm Delight from DenverWhimsyCrochet.com, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to measure your gauge, and I'm going to show you how to make one of these little handy dandy gauge swatches. So I'm going to show you how to do this for when you're making a beanie. It's important to make a gauge swatch before you start a new beanie pattern, because if you don't, you might either make the beanie too big or too small. And if that happens, then you have to rip out your project and go all the way back to the increase round and either make it bigger or smaller, and you waste a lot of time. So do yourself a favor when you're starting a new pattern that you've never done before and you want to make it a certain size to fit a certain person, let's say your boyfriend or your friend's new baby, make a gauge swatch first. It's kind of a pain because you want to start the beanie pattern as soon as possible, but stop. Take 10 minutes, maybe 15, make one of these little gauge swatches, measure it, make sure you're on the right track with your hook size and your yarn size, and then you'll know that your finished project is going to be the right size for the person you're making it for. So today I'm going to show you again how to make a gauge swatch, and then how to measure and how to read the pattern to make sure that you are making your gauge the right size for your project. So let's get started. Okay, so here is my gauge swatch up close, and I'm going to measure this. Now that I made it, I'm going to measure it and make sure I'm on the right track to make my project the right size. And so in a standard pattern, it's going to say that your gauge needs to be for 4 inches. And it's going to tell you 4 inches equals maybe 13 stitches across and 14 rows, which is pretty standard with one of my patterns with this type of yarn. So I would, if I was going to make a gauge swatch before I start, I would make this piece, and I would not make it 4 inches across, because as I said before, making a gauge swatch is kind of a pain. So I want to actually make it smaller so that it goes faster, and then I'm going to double it. So here's how that works. I am going to measure 2 inches on this gauge swatch, and then I'm going to double it to get 4. I'll go over this again, but just giving you kind of an overview here. So 2 inches across and 2 inches up and down. So I make the gauge swatch actually about 3 inches. This one's actually 3.5 by 3 inches. Again, a little over 3 inches. Because I'm going to be measuring my 2-inch square in the middle. If I just made it 2 by 2, I wouldn't get an accurate measurement, because you can see down here on the edges, it's a little bit different gauge because it's on the edge and it's not pulled as tight, or it's pulled tighter depending on how you crochet. So I want to make the gauge swatch a little bit bigger than what I'm going to be measuring so that I can measure in the middle to get my most accurate measurement. Okay, so let's review that quickly. Your pattern says 4 inches. You're going to make your gauge swatch 3 inches. You're going to measure 2 inches, and then you're going to double it to find out if you have the right gauge. Okay, so we'll come back to this in a minute. First, I'm going to show you how to make the gauge swatch. So I made this one, bring this back here. I made this one with this size hook. It's an I9 5.5 millimeter hook. And I'm going to use it again to make one, same type of yarn, same brand actually, same weight, it's just a different color. I'm just going to show you what I did to start. I made a slip knot and pull the slip knot tight to your hook, and then I made chains. So weird to crochet at this angle with the camera, but oh well. Okay, so I'm making chains, and remember, I am trying to make this about 3 inches across, and it doesn't really matter if it's bigger than 3 inches. It just needs to be at least 3 inches. So I usually end up making them a little bit bigger just to be safe. Better to be bigger than smaller in this situation. So I'm crocheting, I don't really know how many I'm doing. I'm just trying to make it at least 3 inches. All right, so I've got a length here. Actually, this is probably too long. And so, oh my goodness, it's way too long. So I'm gonna measure it. I only want it to be 3 inches and I have over 4. So I'm gonna pull some out now, which is usually what happens. And I'm gonna try again. It's still close to 4, so I'm gonna pull some more out. Because again, I want to make this as small as possible to do the job because it's kind of a pain to make it, so I don't want to make it too much bigger. Okay, so this one's about 3.5, so I'm going to be happy with that. All right, so now, this is if you're going to make a square. You've probably done this at some point with crocheting. You go into your second chain from the hook. So this was the last chain I did right here. I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to go in here to make a single crochet. And I'm going to single crochet in all of these spaces. And you don't need to count any of this part. You don't want to count anything until you finish the gauge swatch because it's not, as I said, on the edges, it's not going to be as accurate, so it doesn't help you to count. It's going to just confuse you. All right, so just want to make sure that you know how to do this in case you've never done a square before. Although probably most of you have because it's the first thing that I did when I learned how to crochet. So if you don't know how to do this, you probably need to take a step back and do this first. All right, so getting down to the end, just got 2 more single crochets. Okay, so I'm back to the very first chain that I made. So now I'm going to chain 1. I'm going to turn it around, and then I'm going to go right back into that last top of the single crochet I made. And I'm going to keep going. Okay, so this is how to make the gauge swatch. And I'm just going to go and I'm going to keep making row after row after row until it is 3 inches wide. So now that I made my gauge swatch, I'm going to go ahead and measure my 2 inch by 2 inch square. And this is when it gets a little bit tricky, so let's just do our best here. So I want to, again, this is about 3.5 by 3.5. So I only want to measure 2 inches in the middle, so I'm going to start right about here. And first I'm going to measure the stitches because it's a little bit easier. So you can see this little bump right here. This is 1 stitch. So I'm going to put a stitch marker there. And then I'm going to use my ruler, and it's easier if you use a hard ruler versus like a measuring tape because you're going to be more accurate. So I'm going to count the stitch where my stitch marker is, so I'm going to put the end of the ruler right on the edge of that stitch. Okay, and then I'm going to go over to where it has 2 inches is right there. So it looks like if I go to the end of this stitch right here, I will get my 2 inches. So I'm going to put my stitch marker here. And then I'm going to count the stitches in between these two. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and so that means, again, I have to double this because my pattern said 4 inches, and I've only measured 2. So, quick math, 6 times 2 is 12. So my gauge is 4 inches equals 12 stitches. And again, the stitches part means across. Okay, so now I'm going to measure my rows. I'm going to move these to a different spot. Okay, so I'm going to turn it, and I think this part is harder a little bit. So let's just look at what our rows are. So this right here, see how these little troughs right here, this is 2 rows. And the middle between the two is this little bump right here. okay? So try to keep that in mind if that helps. I get confused sometimes when I look at this, so you might have to measure this a few times to get kind of the results that you want, but hopefully I can get this on the first try. All right, so I'm going to start with this row right here, and I'm going to put my stitch marker in this little trough part, so I'm hoping that's going to help me with my counting. So this is actually the very edge of my row. So I'm going to start my ruler there and go my 2 inches. Actually, I don't like this because, well, it's taking me a little bit close to that edge. And like I said, when you get to the edge, it's not very accurate. So I'm going to try it from here instead. See these little bumps? This is one more row to the left than I had it before. So this is, I'm going to put it now. So this is the top. This little bump right here is the top of a row. And then I'm going to measure it. Let me put it down on the ground here. Be a little bit more accurate. So I'm going to measure 2 inches, and I'm going to end up in this little trough part of the row. Okay, so this is my 2 inches, and I'm going to try to count. Let me count with my, all right, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so 7 rows across. So 7 times 2 is 14. So what I have just made, my little gauge swatch right here, is 12. For 4 inches, it is 12 by 14. Okay, so now I'm going to refer back to my pattern. I'm going to see what I need to have for 4 inches. And if it says 12 by 14, then I'm good. I know that I have the right size hook and the right size yarn. But if it says something different, let's say it says 4 inches equals 11 by 13, then I'm going to need to use a bigger size hook because I want to have fewer stitches and rows. But let's say it says, the pattern says 4 inches equals maybe 14 by 16. So that means I need to use a smaller hook because I need to have more stitches in 4 inches. So hopefully that's not confusing, but if your gauge swatch isn't right for the pattern that you're trying to make, here's what you can do. So here are 3 different hook sizes. And this is this is the one I used to make this. And this is the biggest one I have here. So if I wanted to change sizes, if this gauge swatch wasn't right for my pattern, I would need to make another gauge swatch with a different size hook. And so I have, this size is a 5mm hook, and this is a 4.25mm. So what I've found usually is that if I make a gauge swatch with this size, the next size down is going to be so similar that I'm not going to have much of a difference. So I'll actually skip down to this one to make a new size. And the same thing would be if you're going up. If you need to make it bigger, skip up to like a 6.5mm. Because if you just go to a 6, you're not going to change enough to make a difference. Okay, so that is what I suggest. Hopefully, if you're lucky, you'll get it right on the first time and you won't have to worry about it. But if you need to make a new one to make sure that it matches your pattern, that is what I suggest. So I hope this helped you learn how to make a gauge swatch and how to measure it so that you can make sure your beanies are the right size. Thanks for watching.